Um, wait.
Hmm?
Can I go first, please?
Why?
I'm not wearing any, um...
You're not wearing any what?
You see, I don't want you, looking up at me from below.
Hell no, you going first, lady. I want to see that good.
Oh! Oh,
The fuck, game?
fine.
Make her go first.
Ah, be that way.
God damn it, game. Why give me a choice if you won't let me see that good? Fuck it, go ahead. But wait a second, you weren't complaining about not wearing any panties here, you lying bitch. What's up, everybody? I'm Private Hudson, and this is Disaster Report. Disaster Report is a survival game with crafting elements. Now that pretty much describes 90% of the games on Steam in early access right now, but this is a game for the PlayStation 2. Now before I start this review proper, there's a couple of things I need to let you folks know. I recorded this footage several months ago before I acquired an Elgato. All this footage is recorded from a PlayStation 2 emulator, and since emulation is far from perfect, there are some issues. As you probably noticed from my comedic attempt of an intro, the cursor when it comes to selecting dialogue options or managing your inventory is invisible. Also, some footage is blurrier than the rest due to emulator settings, but at the end of the day, all this footage looks vastly superior than if you were playing this game natively on a PS2. Lastly, one of the biggest issues this game has is massive slowdowns during scripted sequences of buildings collapsing around you. The emulation has actually gotten rid of that, so unfortunately that's something I can't really focus on in this review. But keep in mind, throughout this review, if you see buildings collapsing from aftershocks, if you're playing this on a PS2, there would be a shit ton of slowdown. Disaster Report has a brilliant and original concept, which unfortunately no developer seems to use, and that is the idea of surviving a natural disaster. The game takes place on a fictional man-made island called Stiver Island. You play as journalist Keith Helm, who's on his way to Capital City for his first day of work. Unfortunately for Keith, an earthquake strikes the island, and the island itself begins sinking into the Pacific Ocean. The bridge that he was on gets destroyed, so he's forced to venture forth and find some way to evacuate. Keith meets several characters along the way. There's Karen, an extremely whiny woman in her 20s, Greg, a freelance journalist who's always smoking a cigarette even if it's raining, and Kelly, a girl who got separated from her younger brother and is now looking for him. The structure of the game is pretty simple. Right in the beginning, you're told the location of an evacuation center. You go from level to level, avoiding collapsing buildings, solving basic puzzles, meeting up with other survivors, and collecting various items. While the game is completely linear, the levels are actually very large and are open to exploration. You can find hidden collectible compasses, or you can get closer looks of submerged skyscrapers. Karen is getting wet from the rain. Will you let her use the umbrella? Hell no, should have shown me that good. So, now that I've given you the general overview of the game, is it any good? The short answer is no. The long answer is, well, where do I begin? For starters, the game lacks difficulty. You have two bars in the top left. One is your health, the other is your thirst. Keith must have an extreme hangover or is severely dehydrated or something is wrong with this guy because he just can't stop drinking water. His thirst bar depletes at a cheetah's pace. Luckily for us, there are water fountains everywhere. Literally everywhere. You can also carry a bunch of water bottles in your backpack. Water fountains never run out of water, so you can drink from them all you want and refill your bottles as often as you like. They're also used as save points. The game does offer a hard difficulty setting, but all it does is just decrease the length of the thirst meter. Nothing else is different. So since thirst is not an issue, what about health? That's also not an issue. If you ever end up dying, you simply restart at the nearest checkpoint, which is always a few steps away from where you died. And when you restart, you come back at full HP. This makes things like carrying bandages and first aid kits simply pointless. As a matter of fact, most of the items in this game are useless, so is the crafting system. There are very few things that you can craft and disassemble. At best, you can combine a flashlight with a construction helmet, or juice powder with water into a water bottle to get juice. And all the clothing you pick up is useless as well. They do not offer any extra protection. They just make Keith look like a fucking dumbass. With that said, there is a nice little touch here. If you pick up sunglasses, then go into first-person view, your view will be either darker or yellowed, depending on what type of shades you're wearing. And the further you get into the game, the more tattered your regular clothing gets. Kind of like Batman's outfit in the Arkham games. The controls are terrible as well. The left analog stick controls your character, but it is so sensitive. There are so many times I fell off ledges because the second I tapped on the stick, Keith just turned into fucking Usain Bolt. The camera never follows you, and the right analog stick does nothing. The only way to center the camera behind you is to press L2. Or you can go into first person view by holding down triangle, look at a different direction, or the direction you want to go, then let go. Keith will then be looking at that direction in third person, and the camera will be directly behind him. You folks should clearly see that Disaster Report has some of the lowest production value possible. The graphics are very bland and basic. It has a very limited color palette, and some things just lack textures. It reminds me of some old 3D games for the Atari Jaguar that had textureless polygons. When it comes to audio, pretty much the only sound effects you'll ever hear are your footsteps or a 3-second looping sound of buildings crumbling from earthquake aftershocks. Voice acting is abysmal. I know that Japanese games that have been localized to English have historically had bad voice acting, but this one takes the cake. Characters only have one scream, and it often repeats itself. It gets really annoying. And the only time you'll ever hear music playing is when you're running away from a scripted disaster. It's also only one song, and the only song in the game. Speaking of these scripted sequences, it's too bad these moments are all scripted instead of being random, but of course this is a PlayStation 2 game with what looks like a non-existent budget. I can't possibly expect anything better. They're the game's strongest point, but unfortunately they have issues as well. There are so many moments where you die instantly because you didn't immediately start running when the sequence started. Then there are moments where you die because you ran too fast and something ended up falling on your head like a car. And finally there are moments where you die because the controls are dog shit and Keith doesn't move the way you want him to. You have to repeat these things several times in order to memorize what path to take. It becomes really tedious and loses the adrenaline-filled experience it's supposed to evoke. On the bright side, at least the checkpoint is right before you activated the scripted sequence. Lastly, there's the story. What I found so compelling about this game at first was that it felt kind of realistic. You're just a regular guy trying to survive an earthquake. Then shortly into the game, all this talk about conspiracy theories start. Then later into the game, shit like this happens. So yeah, Disaster Report isn't a good game, but at the same time it's not a terrible one either. It's pretty mediocre, but it has such a great concept to it that it kind of compels you to play it from start to finish. I actually beat this game around 8 times. 6 times were back in the day, at least 10 years ago on my PS2. The other 2 were done for the purpose of this review. The game does have 4 endings, but to be honest, they're not all that different from each other. There's also around 3 sort of failure endings that you get if you abandon your friends and decide to escape alone, but these don't count and the game simply restarts you from the last checkpoint. With all my criticism of Disaster Report, it's still worth playing through if you can get a hold of a copy or if you decide to emulate it, because there really isn't anything like this game. It's a pretty short game, around 5 hours long, but I do recommend playing through it twice, at least twice. About 2 hours into the game, you're left with a decision to make. Karen wants to go home to find her dog, while Greg wants to continue going on the original path. Both paths have their own unique levels, kind of like Witcher 2, but obviously not to that kind of extent, but something similar to that. An interesting thing about Disaster Report was that Keith and Karen's hair in the original Japanese version were black. They changed them to blonde to make them look more Western for the North American and European market. Hate to break it to you guys, but changing their hair color does nothing for the way their eyes are shaped. So they don't end up looking Western, they end up looking like they're part of a fucking K-pop band. Disaster Report had a direct sequel known as Raw Danger in the West, which also was released for the PlayStation 2. It was a lot more of an ambitious game, since you play it as around 6 different characters, and each character's scenario had different endings that affected other characters' stories. I only finished it once, and it was a really long time ago, but I might replay it, and maybe review it for this channel. Speaking of changing things for the Western audience, the first character you play as in that game is a waiter. And when the disaster strikes, you're in a room with about another dozen waiters, all with Japanese eye shapes, but blonde hair. There was another sequel that was exclusive to the PSP and sadly was only released in Japan. Another game was supposed to come out for the PS3, but it was cancelled, due to an earthquake that happened in Japan in 2011. Recently, the original creator of the series has bought the rights to it, so the fourth game is currently in production. Hopefully it comes out in the West, hopefully it comes out on PC as well, and hopefully their budget has been increased. To conclude, Disaster Report had a great idea, but the execution was really flawed. But at the end, it's still worth playing if you can get a hold of it, simply because there's nothing quite like it.
Come on, get in! Are you alone?
Yes, I'm alone. Did I see anyone else? Nope. See ya. Should've shown me that good.